meeting for the Mahomet Aquifer Task Force. The first item on our agenda is nominating a subcommittee chair for this subcommittee. I think there were a couple of people who volunteered maybe in the survey that we did.
Yes.
Does anybody have the stack of the draft discussion materials?
This big thick packet. Everybody have the packet? Okay. So I need a motion to nominate, but I need to know who is willing. I think, Larry, were you one of the people who was willing to serve as a subcommittee? No, okay. Do you remember who?
Are you sure? I have a survey that says Larry or Charles Smith. You did.
Chuck Smith's not here, so we can't nominate him in
Well,
absentia, I guess. Or we could.
that's what's going to teach people to get here on time, isn't it?
Okay, so we need a motion from someone to nominate Larry unless somebody else wants to save him from doing that.
I will nominate Mayor Larry Stoner to be the chair of our subcommittee.
Okay, we need, and for the electronic record, I'm going to ask everybody to try to remember to state your name when you make a motion or before you speak so that it's easier for Barb when she's trying to do the minutes in a week.
Would you like me to say it
So
again?
start again, yeah.
Teresa Barnett, I nominate Mayor Larry Stoner to be the chair of our subcommittee.
And is there a second?
Mayor Julie Moore Wolf from Decatur, I second that.
All right, so any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries and. Sure, I'd be, do you want me to go ahead and run today? That'd be fine. I'm happy to do that. And committee consensus, that's all right? Okay, all right. So the next item on our agenda was to discuss the presentations that we've already received because we haven't had much of an opportunity to discuss those in depth. And the agency was kind enough to provide for us kind of the bullet points again in that and information in that big thick document that we passed out, with the idea that we are going to start getting down to what we're required by statute to do. And so we need to be identifying the areas that we want either more information on or that we feel like we have enough information on so that we can move forward. So it probably makes sense. If you look at the draft for discussion, this first page of this big thick packet, we are actually subcommittee B, which is identifying actions that might be taken to ensure the long-term protection of the aquifer. So if we start with each of the bullet points, we can maybe identify some items under each of the bullet points that we want to have included in our final report and that we want to be working on. So the first one is relating to gas storage fields. And I think there are a lot of issues there that relate to, I think, actions and legislation that we'd like to see. So somebody want to kick off the discussion of what we'd like to see under that section?
Well, and Senator, I think you were getting ready to say something, but also in the.
Oh, you know what?
I just wanted to draw the subcommittee's attention to the document itself. Under the natural gas, it lays out all the existing federal law that just was adopted in 2017. So you need to kind of be aware of what was just adopted and is coming into place. in the document, go to B, third page, under the gas storage field bullet. This PIMSA has interim final regs, and they've incorporated by reference the American Petroleum Institute recommended practices, and those are not shoulds, those are shalls now. So all of the items under that incorporation are required. And we're trying to get a copy of that. Somebody's going to contact API to see if, because sometimes government agencies, because there's a copyright on the thing. So sometimes government agencies, they'll work with us to make copies available, because I think you need to see that and see what's already required.
So there's a list under item B of items that are available but not being utilized. So there's a bunch of statutes and rules listed. So what do you mean by they're not being utilized? You mean that the agency is not enforcing those sections?
No one, is this on? Okay. No one's adopted a regulated recharge area. And if I look at other communities, Tazewell County has adopted an overlay zoning ordinance. I don't think other counties have done that. I'm not aware of any other wellhead protection ordinances like Tazewell, or I'm not aware of any necessarily that have adopted source water protection plans, and not that many that have expanded their setback zones under the act. So there's a lot of authority there that could be taken advantage of.
So our recommendation could be to local governments to take advantage of each of these items. That could be one of our recommendations.
That's correct.
Andrew Rain with Prairie Rivers Network. What are, I guess these regulations are at different scopes of local government? Or is it all like county level? Is it all?
The regulated recharge area is a pollution control board regulation, and some of you may be familiar with the board, some may not. I know our chairperson is, since she used to be on the pollution or work for the pollution control board. The expanded setbacks is under the authority of municipal and county governments, and also the protection ordinances are either home rule authority or county authorities. And then the source water protection plans are something that's proposed currently before the board, pollution control board, and so it kind of lays out a template for how you would develop a source water protection plan. So source water protection, what I'm talking about is many of the communities in Mahomet Aquifer are using community water supplies. And that community water supply could delineate where their water's coming from, look at the potential sources, and then come up with a protection plan to deal with existing potential sources as well as future potential sources. So that's like what Tazewell or Pekin did in their overlay zoning ordinance.
So my question about that is, if the rules are pending at the Pollution Control Board, should we be considering filing comments in support of the rules?
You could, sure.
So is that an action that, and obviously we'd probably want to look at the rules before we made that determination, but I'm thinking that that might be a tangible thing that we could do to move forward to support them getting adopted.
That would be beneficial to us. We did do outreach, and we do have a Governor's Groundwater Advisory Council that's statutory, and so it's comprised of different interest groups, industrial, agricultural, environmental, et cetera, and they held an outreach session before we proposed that to the board, so it has been vetted pretty well. We always try to do that before we propose something to the board.
Do you know when the comment period is?
Ooh, I'd have to look, Deb.
Okay. So that's something that this subcommittee would be interested in pursuing is preparing comments in support of the source water protection plan rules. So do we want to motion and second to have our staff provide us copies of the rules and maybe some drafts of prepared comments supporting? Okay. So we have a motion and a second. Are there any comments? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Pose same sign. Motion carries. With respect to these other rules that are listed in this first section, do we want to be provided with copies of those rules for our next meeting? To see if we want to, as part of our recommendation in the report, recommend that these various entities take advantage of the rules that currently exist?
I'd say it's a good idea.
Teresa?
Andrew again with Prairie Rivers Network. I guess I would like to know more about these rules, and I think simply having, I mean, I can look this up and read it, but I think it would help to have a presentation from somebody who understands it, to have the practical, here's how it works, here's how, it could be applied. Yeah, I think that'd be very beneficial.
Teresa Barnett, for Chairman, is there anything that you can give just a brief overview of what you're doing with Tazewell?
But I can get what we've done thus far and get that to the committee to get that out.
So, Andrew, I think you're requesting at our next meeting, maybe a brief presentation on what each of these items are and how they would be applied in the local or county level government setting?
Yeah.
Okay, is that something that you all can do? I'm looking down to the, the people who do.
Yeah, I mean, I can do we can either get other people to do it, or I can do it, but I could do the regulated recharge area, the expanded setbacks, I mean, I can do the ordinances. There was a team of local grassroots group that did that. So we can either get somebody from that level to do it. For example, Bill Compton, who's the chair of our Governor's Groundwater Advisory Council, he worked on that, but he's also used to be with Caterpillar Corporate Environmental Affairs. And he also was chairperson of his own water district, so pretty sharp cookie. So, I mean, somebody like that could be brought in to do the Pekin or the Tazewell. I mean, I can easily do the expanded setbacks, and I can do the regulated recharge area, because we did one of those for Pleasant Valley Public Water District.
That would be great, because I can imagine that we might choose as a subcommittee to recommend to the broader group that the various municipal and county governments that are on the aquifer, that one of our recommendations is that they take action under each of these regulations so that they could help us protect the aquifer. I mean, I'm trying to, I guess, get at tangible actions, because that ultimately we've got to write a report with some recommendations in it.
The regulated recharge area, for example, had things like prohibiting new and special waste landfills within the boundary of the recharge area. That was adopted by the Pollution Control Board. I mean, I've seen folks talking about that. And then there were also certain types of things for educational and pollution prevention type things for existing sources that may have hazardous substances, and sort of a training and best management practices for those hazardous substances, and what do you do if there's a release and that kind of thing. So
So I think we have general consensus to ask you to come back and report at the next subcommittee meeting on that. Yes, Charles?
Charles Hostetler with PDC. I've got a little bit of concern, maybe it's similar to what Andrew was trying to express, about, number one, making sure that we understand the content and how well these existing things have worked before we recommend more action along those lines. So that's sort of speaking as a member of the regulated community, there are regulations that are not effective or not useful and are not protective. So rather than a blanket recommendation for approval, I think it's important to at least understand the content of these things and how well they've worked. The second concern I always have is when we're talking about this is unfunded mandates. And so what I'd like to hear from the cities and the counties and so on is whether they have the resources to do this. Everybody's being stretched thinner and thinner. And it's okay to recommend that somebody do this, but if it isn't in the county budget or in the city budget and there's no resources to do it, our recommendation won't have any force or effectiveness. So those are my comments. Thank you.
I think it's also possible that maybe we should consider having template information available to the extent it's not specific to a particular area. So if it's, this is the resolution you would need in order to adopt a groundwater or a wellhead overlay district. That way we could have a packet that was prepared that could be, changed up a little bit for each of the communities, but they wouldn't have to start from scratch and everybody pay a lawyer and all the rest of it to do it.
And just a couple of follow-ups on what Charles just said. Those things are true. That's why I was kind of recommending maybe we should have somebody other than a regulator do the presentation. For example, Bill Compton is a business person and he would know and ran a water supply and, worked with all sides of the equation. And then the other thing I'll mention is the source water protection planning requirements that I described there. That definitely builds on what he said in that the vision statement that each community individually would develop. It gets to the template idea. That vision statement is based on the resources that you actually have, or, I'm saying you, the entity actually has to implement something, because we saw Pekin do it. They did it from a grassroots level, and then I saw another place try to adopt the same exact ordinance, and it did not work. In Pekin, it works. Up in Marengo, up in McHenry County, they tried to do the same thing. It didn't work because they didn't customize it to their own needs. So those are all valid points. And like I said, if you'd feel better having someone like Bill or, other than a regulator tell you about it, then be happy to do that.
Bill wants to participate. I mean, he sent me an email and.
Did he? Bill
Yeah,
Compton? Good.
And anything he can do.
Yeah, he's chair of our governor's groundwater advisory council, and like I said, he knows all the issues that you brought up.
I think that would be great. It's not like you won't be at the meeting to
No.
answer questions, so having his input would be
Bill will
good.
call on me wherever, but
So you have a
those were
note to invite
grassroots
him.
developed. The regulated recharge area in Pleasant Valley was grassroots, and the Pekin and the Tazewell County were grassroots. It wasn't the agency coming in and saying, you shall do this. That's not the way it was. That doesn't work for that kind of thing.
Okay. Anything further on that first section?
No, but if I can take us back one bullet.
And Alec, I'm going to have you say who you are. So
Sure,
Barb
sure.
can-
Alec Davis with the Illinois Environmental Regulatory Group. On the gas storage conversation, if we could line up somebody from DNR or PHMSA or something like that, maybe in a supplement to getting our hands on the language itself, I think would be useful to hear from somebody who knows a little bit about the rules and how they might be implemented.
We have that lined up with Mike Mankowski,
Okay.
but we wanted to wait until after he had the PIMSA training, which Barb, when was that?
He will be at the training the week of our April task force meetings. So we have him lined up to come to the May task force meeting.
So he'll be better prepared because he'll be getting the training from the feds on whatever the state needs to do to become recognized by the feds as a implementer of the program, I assume. So,
It would also be nice to know what the rules actually entail, because I think some of Senator Rose's concerns with, notice and monitoring and all of that,
Right.
if the implementation of these rules is going to cover that, then that's a whole section of things that maybe we don't need to go into.
well, we'll see what we can do with getting that API document, because my read of it, and it does have public awareness, damage prevention communications, utilization of damage prevention systems, education of the public on the hazards related to unintended releases, indications of a release, procedures for reporting of the release, and actions to be taken for public safety. So I'm not an expert in that, but that was my read of what.
And Rick, I believe I got an email from Alec this morning about our conversation about that on Friday. And Alec, who is downtown in Springfield speaking on the Volkswagen stuff and was unable to be here today, I believe he was able to get a hold of that document
Excellent. So I
so
think
that we can get a copy of that for the task force.
that would be great, so you guys can read it and come to your own
Right,
conclusions.
because we had this discussion prior to, because we wanted to get a hold of that for everybody.
I'd like to make a comment, Jim Risley, Mahomet School District. I'm listening to the potential rules that we have or at our disposal, and you're bringing up Chapin Rose's recommendations. Is those recommendations, can they be potentially implemented with these rules that are out there for us? Can they be matched to those and can move those forward on this issues?
You were wanting to comment, so go ahead,
well,
Senator.
I got a shotgun worth of bills I filed. I mean, it just, but, I would say part of it would be no, because the counties can't control DNR, for example. And DNR has primary jurisdictional authority over pipelines and storage. So one of the bills that passed committee this week would allow or would require DNR to do annual maintenance inspections of natural gas storage fields on the Mahomet Aquifer. Okay. The other one would be change the notice requirements in the event of some sort of incident. That might end up playing into this PIMSA rules. I'm not sure how it interplays yet because we haven't really seen them. But that, I know they're monkeying around with the notice requirements too. But those two are, to me, extremely important because we don't want another problem. And that's the point of the annual inspections by DNR. And I might add to be paid for by people's gas, not by the taxpayers. But the other one is, I think, is as important as the best practices, is having DNR look at the best practices. And we got EPA here. But let's not forget, as far as gas storage goes, DNR is the one who's got authority over it. EPA only shows up after there's a problem. So I would add, while I've got the floor, my continuing biggest problem with this has been the fact there's been no environmental review of where this thing is. And I think that needs to be part of this conversation. I'm not sure, am I reading so far of PIMS or whatever we're calling it, that it's that comprehensive as to what you do after the fact. I think it's lacking on maintenance on the front end, and I think it's doesn't exactly prescribe a whole lot on what to do on the back end. You know, mines and minerals at DNR, if you're a mine, you have to post a bond, you know, in the event that you were to fail to close that mine. And then the taxpayers could seize that bond in order to, you know, close the mine. But in this instance, there's no requirement for natural gas storage that there be any kind of a plan, an emergency action plan. In fact, that's why I was so excited to get Teresa on here, because I was hoping that we could get, part of the focus of this committee would be to come up with a agreed emergency action plan in the event of a problem, and push for that as well. So emergency response plan, you know, the other thing I had down is, as far as the future goes, we heard from the U of I about the need to thoroughly map the aquifer with that LiDAR technology. I think that could be another recommendation of the group, as far as helping us. But I've got one other thing that I wanted to talk about, and then fortunately I've got to go to a meeting that just started elsewhere. But Landon Stinger, my chief of staff, is going to stay. I want to throw out, because we're focusing a lot on the natural gas issue, but what started this all was landfill issue. And I'll restate for the record, I've said it many times, I'm less concerned what's in a modern design landfill than I am what's in all these old closed landfills that we're just now starting to map through EPA, and there's really no testing. So one of the recommendations I would suggest we should do for these old closed landfills is not only to ensure that EPA has given us a complete map, and I think that's as complete as you guys can get it probably for now, but you know, not knowing that, you know, the old town dump in Hume might have been here or there, and you just don't know that. But we need to start figuring out some way to monitor the groundwater quality around those closed landfills. And that doesn't really impact your business at all, Charles, but I'm way more concerned about those than I am a modern design monitored situation, because nobody knows what's in those old ones. Nobody knows.
May I add on to that? Just one. I think, this is Charles Hostetler with the PDC. It's important to understand what we mean. At least it's important to us to understand what we mean by a closed landfill. Okay. So when we site a landfill and we get siting authority, and then we get the permit to operate it, it has an operating life. And depending on when that operating life started, it might be under a different set of regulations. So no matter what set of regulations it was under, when it closed, there's a post-closure care period where the landfill sits. And depending on the regulations, it may or may not be monitored. I mean, you guys are familiar with this. Then at the end of post-closure care, if all the requirements are met, then it can be removed from post-closure care and an affidavit can be filed and it's no longer a landfill. So I totally get the concern. What I would avoid using for this would be the word closed, because, and I would emphasize the unmonitored nature of it.
Yeah.
Because many landfills that are closed are being monitored just with the same frequency as they were when they were active and accepting waste.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point about what might be the legal definition of closed versus the nomenclature, right? Yeah, yeah. I'll just give you the perfect example. In Charleston, where I grew up, we have the town branch, which flows into the Embrough River, and the old town dump is right on the edge of the town branch. And in environmental science class, we used to go out there and walk the creek and pull up all this trash from, 50 years ago. Well, it closed before there was even an EPA. So no one knows what's in that, and no one knows what's flowing out of it. And I think that there is, truthfully, way more concern from my perspective about those than there is about what is already out there that may have legally closed, and because no one knows what's in it and no one knows if it's leaked out of it. And so I would just throw that out there as another thing to think about. Thank you.
Just to add another fine point too, there's pre-law, pre-landfill law landfills. And when the new law came into being, they were allowed two options. One, close, or two, meet the new requirements of the new regs. So I think another thing you're talking about, Chapin, are the pre-law landfills that didn't have any design standards and may not have had any type of monitoring either. Yeah. No. You had two choices, close or meet the new requirements. And it's hard to retrofit, you know, dig it all up and put a liner, you know what I mean? And then it may have already been contaminated, so how do you determine background? Because you have to comply with background. No,
Yeah, there's no liner that's
no.
timed up in Charleston.
It's just a hole in the ground like a gravel pit.
Question about that. So the ones that closed, because we're being careful about this terminology, the ones that closed when the law came out, close or comply, if they said, okay, we closed, do they have to install monitoring then, or are they still exempt?
No, they had to meet one of two requirements, close or meet the new requirements.
Right. So they did not have to meet any closure requirements. Either.
No.
They just said we're done and okay.
I'll add a little bit of detail. It depends on when that happened and under what law, 807, 813, or 811. So we closed a landfill. It can remain anonymous for right now, it doesn't matter, under 807, and we installed gas control in it, and it had a groundwater monitoring network, and we expanded that as part of the closure plan. So it depends on when it was with respect to changes in the law as to whether or not monitoring is ongoing or was required. But many of these are what I'll just call like pre-1984. There was no regulation at all. There was no requirement for siting. There was no requirement for monitoring. There wasn't really any requirement for operating, except you couldn't be a nuisance. And when they were done, they threw the dirt back on top, and that was it. There's no notation on the deed like we have to do now. Those are all the things I think Senator Rose is talking about.
Mm-hmm. So we have a map here. Sorry, Andrew Rain with Prairie Rivers Network again. We have a map somewhere in this packet that has sort of, let's see, active landfills, of which it looks like there's just a small handful.
3.
And then historic landfills. And I feel like we've here recognized that there's more terminology here than we need to understand. So
There is, and
could we map this?
I've perused that.
Could we map this in a way that says, you know, I want to know which of these landfills are the ones that were, you know, closed and have nothing, or the ones that had some limit, you know, just so we can have some gradients of how protected are these areas and how much of them are the, you know, they're really
I
totally
totally
unprotected.
concur with that. I know that there's landfills on this list that are being actively monitored now. And I know that there are ones that were never monitored. So adding that texture, I think, is really important to satisfy Senator Rose's concerns and our concerns as well. You have a lot more information on some of these that closed under 811 than others, and it's important to recognize that, or we won't be hitting the priorities.
And are there really only 4 active now?
I think there's 3.
This map has 4. I can't read the names because the resolution. Maybe one of them is just outside. The middle north one is maybe just outside.
That's McLean. That, I think, technically is just over the boundary, but that's getting ready to close. It'll close later this year. I think the 4th one that is just outside is the one to the east. I think it belongs to Republic. I'm not positive. In the very east part of Vermilion County, right next to that green line.
Yeah, those are right on the boundary.
They're very, very close. The other two are Indian Creek, that's a PDC landfill, and Clinton. And those are both active with a lot of future life in their permitted lifetime.
And is there any proposal for future landfills? Do we know? I mean, publicly at least, is there?
Not that I'm aware of.
The way you would become aware of it is somebody would file for citing.
Okay, and
And,
that hasn't happened yet?
As far as I know, with respect to the sole source boundary, there are no pending citing applications.
Is there something preventing that, like, in the rules, or is that just nobody happened to have wanted to open a landfill?
Well, there are new requirements if it's a brand-new facility. That's what I put in the, let's see, what page is that on? If you're within a federal sole source aquifer, so I think one of the questions is what can you do with that authority, or what does it do? And let's see,
It's labeled section 811.302. It's.
what page is?
It's maybe four, let me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, it's the 5th page in. And
Oh, I see, it says 811.302.
yeah, that's a citing standard.
Yeah,
for
so
new pollution control facility.
there are, if it's a brand-new facility, there are more stringent standards, and those are listed right here.
You can open a landfill,
No,
though.
No,
it doesn't say that. I don't think,
The local citing authority would have to agree that these requirements would have been met.
Right,
yeah.
but I mean, it's possible that a landfill could open over the
Totally.
aquifer.
If-
Okay.
Right.
If these requirements are met.
Okay.
And the local citing authority's
Sure,
satisfaction.
sure.
now, the other thing I'll mention is, but this is basically on the regional level, it doesn't mean there aren't more local level geology that isn't being covered, but if you wanted to at least take a look at your priority areas in the aquifer, you'd overlay those older, whatever we want to call them, landfills, relative to the potential for aquifer recharge. I mean, it's not that there aren't areas that need to be delineated further, but those are no-brainers. So if you wanted to look at, you know what I'm talking about? It's here, it's in here, that map, the red zones.
You're just saying to be able to identify the high priority areas and then,
First cut on a
Yeah.
regional level, but I don't want you to think that we don't need areas that need more definition, because that's a regional level map. But it's a map that's prepared for planning purposes, and that's what you're doing right now.
Use the recharge area overlay over potential landfill expansion. And then our recommendation would be to disallow landfills within that recharge area.
Well, now that's a step beyond. Now that could be, now that's another whole direction. That could be, okay, if we feel comfortable enough with that area, for example, where George and the surveys have mapped the connection to the Sangamon River, and they're pretty confident that recharge is occurring there, then that area becomes delineated. You propose a regulated recharge area to the board, and within that regulation, you say, no new XYZ.
Is there a reason scientifically within those recharge areas to have absolutely no construction? Does it need to be, pristine ground, or, can it be a parking lot with, different permeable pavement? I mean,
In my opinion, well, you're also mixing in the quantity. Water will find a way. That whole, I think George will probably tell you that, okay, that whole thing about paving is going to reduce recharge. Well, water's going to find a way to get in. I don't think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think your opinion would be that's sort of a housewives, I mean, that's just not reality. And With the peak and wellhead protection area, the goal was, for example, and I just give you an example, is to make uses coexist harmoniously. That's the idea of an overlay zoning ordinance. So it doesn't get into prohibitions. It gets into technology controls to prevent contamination, so the two uses can exist harmoniously. So no, it doesn't have to be everything under the sun. But when we did the Pleasant Valley regulated recharge area, it seemed like, I mean, you wouldn't want any low-level hazardous waste sites, kind of no-brainers. Probably wouldn't want to do a hazardous waste facility in a delineated recharge area for a community water supply. Didn't really get too much objection from anybody on that.
My question is, how do we know that what extra is needed beyond what already exists? So when you do, I mean, you guys.
Oh, that's easy.
Understand the local siting concept of this.
Oh, I do.
No, I'm in the group.
Oh, okay.
So you can't just arbitrarily say, I'm going to put a landfill here and the law doesn't preclude it, and so it's going to, there it is, and then get a permit to operate. It just doesn't work that way.
No.
Local siting is very, very important to what we do, and a number of these things are considered in local siting. So my question
That's a good
to the
point.
group as the whole is, how do we know we need extra law or extra regulation if we don't understand currently what's exist in the process to do it? This
And-
extra might not buy anything.
Well, the law builds out, if you also go to, I think I don't have my Environmental Protection Act here, but there's a thing there called Groundwater Protection Needs Assessment, and it walks through that analysis of exactly what's already there, what additional things, what other groundwater protection needs are, what is the susceptibility, what is the risk. So there is, in the Environmental Protection Act, I didn't bring my copy, I should have. It's either section 14 or section 17.1 or 2 of the act. But it does exactly what Charles says. So, for example, for Pleasant Valley, that's what was done. There was kind of a needs assessment done, an evaluation of the potential sources there and what new potential sources could come in, and kind of a detailed evaluation. And if you're going to propose something like that to the board, the proponent, Pollution Control Board, the burden of proof is on the proponent of the regulation, and you're subject to cross-examination. So you better be able to prove up the merit behind what you're proposing. So it's no cakewalk.
The burden of proof is on the proponent of the person trying to, sorry. You're talking about putting in new regulation? The burden of proof is on the proponent of the new regulation?
That's the way the Pollution Control Board works.
Okay,
That's the standard
Okay,
they work.
yeah.
So if I come to the board and I propose something, the burden of proof is on me to prove up that merit.
Sure. Yeah, so, I mean, just one concern broadly about there is a chance that we don't understand we maybe don't understand the regulation that we have, but we also don't understand all the threats that potentially exist, and we learn about new contamination and new contaminants as time goes on, and then also landfills will fail. No liner lasts for 200 years, and we are talking about this resource on a very long time horizon. So I would want to be very confident that these regulations will continue to protect the aquifer even after 50, 100 years pass, companies don't exist, and it looks a lot different.
So what information are people feeling like they need to start compiling some recommendations? I think we're having good discussions about the issues, but I would like us, at least at the next meeting, to start being able to flush out what are some of the recommendations that we'd like to make and have included in the report. So I think I'm hearing we'd like presentation on the regulations that are listed on our third page under section B. So those could be potentially implemented by the communities along the aquifer. So we need to know what they are and how they work, whether we'd recommend doing that. I've heard that we want information on an emergency response plan and,
That's
Can-
for gas wells
for
specifically.
gas, continuing to include the potential for mapping the aquifer and trying to get funding to do that. Information on whether we're gonna call them closed landfills or out-of-service landfills, but looking at that map and trying to identify what status they're in and whether we need further information on them and whether we would recommend monitoring or additional monitoring on them. And then I think Senator Rose raised issues again relating to the natural gas, whether or not the PIMSA regulations actually cover all of the items that we would want to see covered with respect to inspection and notice and environmental review of the area after a leak. So knowing more about the PIMSA regs. Does that cover? Yep.
Diane Marlin, City of Urbana. I would like to add information on what a sustainable withdrawal from the aquifer is and maintaining the quantity available for the future. We haven't really talked about that at all, but that's, I think, a huge consideration for protection of the aquifer in the long term.
I agree.
Everybody's kind of shaking their heads, yes, and I'm guessing that that's information that George or somebody from PRI can provide.
Yes, that is something, this is George Rocap from the State Water Survey. That is something we can provide, yes, and something that we're in the process of developing new tools from the water sustainability side to identify the vulnerable communities in an area. We're working with the State Geological Survey and really developing some new tools of looking at the permeability of the aquifer, or the whole state, in fact, and how that relates to how much water they're using and how vulnerable they might be to running out. You know, whether the system has more than one or two actively producing wells and stuff. So we are developing some new tools to help get at that quite a bit, because that's a big issue with the IDNR Office of Water Resources.
And to that, I would add, looking at how large-scale users, if large-scale users are actually paying for water that they use from the aquifer, like, or, city residents are paying a monthly fee for water use, but do all the users pay for use of the water?
Rick Cobb, water use in Illinois is regulated under the Water Use Act of 1983. It's a common law doctrine, so no state agency has any authority to permit withdrawals. The only place where the DNR, Office of Water Resources, can give permits is under the Lake Michigan Allocation Act. Otherwise, it's all conflicts are handled in front of a judge between two aggrieved parties. So we don't even have the statutory authority. No agency has that to regulate quantity per se. It's all common law doctrine.
Well, is that a regulation we should be looking at?
Well, that would be a statute, and certainly it's one you could look into. I'm sure it's a topic that many people have a lot of opinions on. It's been tried many times, and it's there's some concerns, especially in northeastern Illinois and the Mahomet Aquifer. There's been concerns. That's been a driver for a lot of the research and things that have been done in the Mahomet. but that's one where you'd want to know who all the stakeholders are. I would bet Steve might have an opinion on that.
You know me pretty good. Let me turn this on here. With your comments there, and I think George touched that a little bit there, the recharge capability of this aquifer from one side to the other. It's interesting from where Branda, you bring that up, where the clay particles and things, he can explain more, your recharge doesn't happen as quick. Compared from the western side where I'm located at as an irrigation farmer, I explained to this group before, a lot of our irrigation wells are 100 foot in depth. Some of mine have 60, 70 foot of thickness of water. Believe me, changing that 4 or 5 feet doesn't affect things very much. In other words, we don't have any issues with municipalities running out of water or anything like that. That is just how plentiful our recharge is over there. So there's a vast difference of the aquifer from the east side to the west side, for lack of a better term, on recharge. And that's where it gets, in my own opinion, a little complicated. You're concerned about recharge, I understand that. We are too over there, but we don't, from an agriculture standpoint, want to be needlessly regulated for a recharge problem that we really don't have, that maybe the other part of the aquifer does, if that makes sense.
But I think we could also, maybe, we can look to other states to see what they are doing with respect to this, and also other agricultural states. I mean, it may make sense to have some agricultural exemptions, given that that's a huge part of our economy here, and it sounds like there's recharge. But then when you look at a huge industrial user that is going to, benefit monetarily from sucking our aquifer dry, basically, and, not pay anything more than a nominal water use fee, no permit, no responsibility. And I don't want to put words in Diane's mouth, but I think there may be a difference there.
Yeah, Andrew with Prairie Rivers Network. I think the issue being brought up is one of recharge and not necessarily industry. And again, I won't put words into your mouth, but I don't think it matters who, if in the area of Champaign-Urbana, who's drawing a lot of water. We need to be protecting our resource. If there isn't a recharge problem in the west part near the Illinois River, maybe we need to be looking at, where are the recharge zones, where are things to be affected, and considering, because there might not be a lot of irrigation here now, but there might be a lot of irrigation in the future. There might not be a water bottling plant now, but there might be a water bottling plant in the future, or any number of other industrial processes. And so, especially in Champaign-Urbana and the eastern part of the aquifer, we do need to think about what we're going to do to protect that. And there was a presentation yesterday at a church about the Mahomet aquifer, and the long-term trajectory of the wells is that the pressure is going, we're not losing water yet, but we're losing pressure heads, so we're drawing the aquifer down, and all the rates of drawdown, none of them were leveling out. So we're looking at a time horizon, and I think the experts, I'd like the ISWS folks to weigh in, but we're looking at this resource being used. We're not sustainably drawing it, we are using it.
Yeah, I guess we can look at an example. I mean, some of it is where you draw the line. So, for example, the Andersons in Champaign was looking to put a ethanol plant in. So, they called my office and they said, where in the state at these 5 locations is there water? Well, I have to tell them where there's water, because the other 4 locations there was no water. And then, is an extra 3 million gallons a day in a town that uses, 25, 30, is that a big issue or not? Where do you start drawing the line, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, we could have 1 million small users come online and run out. I mean, regulations are tough, but I'd rather do something than say, all right, in 100 years, Champaign-Urbana needs to find a new water source.
Do we have recharge data that we could look at over several years? Because I'm guessing that whether it's a drought year or not, all of those things play into recharge. And so if we could get some kind of an average so that we know what a sustainable amount is, what makes us even with respect to drawdown and recharge on any given time frame, 5 years or 10 years?
Yeah. This is George Rocap again. We can put some of that information together, although, sometimes recharge depends on the use. And so over time, because Champaign is using more water is coming in than it used to. And so when Decatur, for example, kicks on, there's areas out west that may become recharge areas that are normally discharge areas. And so it can change, but I think getting back to Rick's point on regulated recharge areas, if it's a local or county decision, it may make more sense in Champaign County, and then if the Mason County or Tazewell County is looking at it, this doesn't make any sense.
Follow up with that, George. To answer your question there, in the western side, in the Mason Tazewell area, we have a local water authority that was put together through the county, if I recall, and my timing might be off, but maybe as much as 20 years ago, and the concern was then was the use and drawdown of water, not only from irrigators, but if quote Springfield or Bloomington or some municipality ever wanted to come for a water source, of having a local governing body to have input into that decision-making process. My point is, there is some local way of doing this, maybe through water authorities or anything, at least that's what we've tried to do over there, and having that body, to have a local body, local people sitting on this to address that issue and come through on that. Did I explain that right, George, your understanding of it?
Yes.
So going back to our statutory marching orders, maybe the question is, should we be looking at recommending that local authorities be developed to monitor recharge areas? Alec, did you have a?
I did, and I was not going to point out Rick's omission, but water authorities do have the ability in Illinois law to regulate withdrawals. So if a local group was able to adopt it, there's, a process for doing that in statute. They have the ability to affect that.
I said no state agencies. We have no constitutional authority. Sorry, Alec.
Right. So again, that would probably be a useful one to hear a presentation on, to understand how they're being used and, the process and everything like that, if that's something we're going to recommend that local units look into.
So we're talking about a meeting year end of the world, probably in June, I think. So maybe we could add to that agenda, having someone from your local water authority come and speak.
I'm sure we could arrange that as we work toward that agenda on that, if somebody could explain how that process works over there and what they do. And I know they've, not only that, but the Illinois State Water Survey was a big help and continues to be a big help in the beginning of that. And so we could go into some discussion on that if we needed to.
Outside that, I think I forgot, Rick Cobb, neglect of language in the Water Use Act. That's what the judge makes the decision on. It says, is there a wasteful or malicious use of the water? So some of the case law in that is, that's where you have experts on either side and you both have attorneys on either side. So the judge is looking at that, and sometimes if the private well owner's well is 50 feet deep and the big industry well is 100 feet deep, but he's using it to produce a product, the judge is going to be saying, is that a wasteful or malicious use? And in some cases, I think the case law has shown that the resolution was that the well owner drill his well deeper. Now, a lot of industries will do the good neighbor policy and just go ahead and do it for them. But the law itself, I mean, unless that use is a wasteful or malicious use, which, I'm envisioning that. I mean, unless they're just running it out on the ground for no purpose, that's a tough call. The other thing I'll mention is there's a little bit of a dichotomy between water quantity and recharge areas and water quality. Whereas on the western end, we have not so much of an issue with the water quantity, but we do have some water quality issues because it's very vulnerable. We've got a real-time monitoring while they're looking at nitrates. I just wanted you to be aware, there's a bit of a dichotomy here when we're talking about recharge areas. Part of the reason you get the cone of depression in Champaign-Urbana or DeWitt is because you have all these low permeability sediments confining the aquifer. So it draws down, and the cone of depression goes out, spreads out a larger distance. Whereas in Mason and Tazewell County, where it's unconfined, and it's sand from the surface down to the bottom of the aquifer, that demand is reached almost instantaneously. You're not exceeding the precipitation.
Now, your data, what is it? Do we have a year's worth, 5 years worth, or how? It's just beginning, and then I call it about a year's worth of
Are
data.
you talking about the real-time data?
Yeah, the real-time.
Yeah, it's 15-minute interval data for a year, and so the high concentration is
At what depth is that getting pulled from?
32 feet,
Okay, I was saying
10
around
foot
30 feet.
screen.
That's all I wanted to make sure I understood that. Okay. the State
No.
Trooper Farm Bureau.
So we're also looking at isotopes there to see if there's any denitrification at 32 feet, which there isn't any showing up. But we're averaging, the high is 22 milligrams per liter, the low is 17.7. And so we're also looking at, with the USGS, what concentrations are going to Quiver Creek, which is going to the Illinois, which is going to the Mississippi River.
Also, what's the drinking water? Is there there's no drinking water standard for nitrate, is that
For
correct?
nitrate, it's acute. It's 10. Yeah, there's definitely a drinking water standard for nitrates.
George, you don't know, when you look at that well, I just have this one question there. And I was gonna check on this, and I have it, like in Mason County or Tazewell County, if I build a house, what is the requirement for a well? It's probably deeper than 32 feet, isn't it?
Drinking water isn't really the concern with this study. I think what we're finding more, Steve, is during low flow conditions, when the nitrate levels shoot up to around 7 milligrams per liter in Quiver Creek, how much is that contributing to the load to the Mississippi River?
Mississippi River.
Which we're all concerned about because Gulf of Mexico is a pretty big economy in this. So the whole Gulf epoxy issue. So it's not really a drinking water issue, as more as how much of that groundwater is discharging to surface water and how much of that's going into the Illinois and how much is going into the Gulf of Mexico.
So we really don't know or have data yet how far that is percolating down into there, just those 32-foot readings so far then?
No, other than it's not.
Okay,
There's no denitrification occurring at 32 feet.
Okay.
So one would expect it to go down a little bit farther.
Yeah, and we have some data from other areas, but certainly not enough data. But that's one of the more education side on things, and there are some hand-driven well points out there, and people shouldn't be drinking out of those because generally as you go down, there's less nitrate. So there is some public education on that point.
Yeah, those are called the sand points that, you're right, that those are still out there, but that's why the reason I reference back to like that is for the drinking water standpoint of it.
Yeah.
I cannot go out there, out and build a house and put a sand point down for my water source anymore. That's just not gonna be approved by the health department or anything like that, and that's been that way for a lot of years, and rightfully so, just for the reasons you said there.
On this, I also at the presentation, they mentioned that that there was sort of an unfunded role of the State Water Survey to look at new wells that are drilled, and wasn't able to get the full note on that. I was wondering if, George, are you familiar with that? Can you speak to that?
Not a whole lot because we don't do it.
Right, but it is part of the Water Use Act, right?
There are some areas in Iroquois County that we kind of get involved with more often. There's like 4 specific townships, but in general, it's not an official process that we look at. It's just as requested.
Not official because it's not funded, or not official because it's not?
Yeah, because we don't have someone dedicated to looking at each permit that comes in. And a lot of them don't really trigger any sort of review.
potential recommendations be requesting that the state actually fund a position to do that work.
I mean, it could, I mean, I guess I'd want to know what the role is going to do, but yeah, I think that that my understanding was that this would look at new wells, especially ones of larger capacity, and assess them and maybe follow up on some tracking so that we could know how much water we're using at some of these wells. Because I don't, again, not the expert, but as I understand it, we don't really know on a lot of the wells how much water is being used, and that they're using like energy data in out west in Tazewell area to sort of back out the pump rates and things like
Well,
that.
Yeah, I mean, in the last few years, we've made tremendous strides. So one of the new requirements, the updated Water Use Act, was for irrigators to report water use. And the legislation was written such that, or the rules adopted, that it was up to the Water Survey to approve or disprove the way that the water use irrigated data was being reported to us. And so there was not a requirement for irrigators to go out and, install a meter even on each of their wells, and they're notoriously inaccurate. But, and so there's several different methods. So we're now getting irrigation data from Champaign County, for example, that we never had prior to 2015.
Sort of voluntary then?
No, so the Champaign County Farm Bureau has taken it on the responsibility of reporting that use to us. So it is aggregated, so we're not, singling individual farmers out, but it also helps us look at the projected irrigation going forward, because in the Imperial Valley Water Authority projected how much irrigation would grow, but then we had a drought and $7 corn went drastically up. So, but that's something we need to look at in Champaign County that we really haven't, is, look at what are the soil types, we can map those out, what ground would likely be irrigated if corn prices go up, and what wouldn't. And so, some of that work can kind of be done to figure out how much, what maximum sort of irrigation would occur. There has been some university studies going way back. It's like, okay, if we have climate change and we have so much drying out, what would be the impact of a lot of irrigation? And it, is quite substantial. But then you also have to factor in corn hybrids that are using water much earlier in the season, so a lot of things are constantly changing.
Yeah, in terms of prediction, I just think it would be good to the extent we can, understand how much we're using.
Yeah, and the method used out in Mason County uses the electrical demand.
Right.
Which is actually, we think, quite a bit more accurate than
Is that
a bunch of individuals guessing.
I mean, is that a unique circumstance in which they have most of their pumps on the same circuit or something? I mean, could that be replicated in other
It's
places?
mostly served by one electric cooperative that uses very little during the wintertime, it's just households essentially, except with a few exceptions. And then
I might, Steve Turner from, Farm Bureau, the simplicity of that is that as an irrigation farmer, I have different well capacity depending on the acres I do. Some of those wells might pump 400 gallon a minute. Some of them pump 1,100 gallon a minute. Think of that standard a minute. It needs so much electricity for that motor to pull that. That's why we feel pretty good about the accuracy of it, really. And let's face it, George could probably say it's accurate also because we have no other real way out there. And right now, we'll tell you that method is good enough that that's how we're meeting the law requirement of submitting our water usage. We feel that strongly about it, that's probably a little better than trying to get each individual irrigated producer to do that. So it's, we got a handle on that. And also, George, this water use reporting requirement for irrigation has got away from me. We've been affected for, it's fairly new, right? 2-3 years we've been in effect that. So it's not been around 8 or 10 years. I stress that because we're in the beginning stages of it. You're getting more data every year and start building that. And yeah, with that, I think there'll be some similarities and some things you can draw from that by saying recharge by what, producers, irrigators do out here as farmers on that when they're running those wells.
And the Imperial Valley's been voluntarily giving us numbers since 1994, I think, so it.
No, it's great. It's just, again, it would be nice to have it on a broader scale, and especially here where we're really sort of, choked by recharge.
Okay, so as we kind of continue through this packet of our bullet points, we don't have page numbers, but we just talked about the page that has the section 811 regs relating to siting. And then the next item is suggesting that the state develop a plan to monitor groundwater quality. And again, our job is to make recommendations, not to necessarily tell them how to do it or how to fund it. So is there any additional information that anybody feels like they need in order to include something like this in a recommendation? Okay.
Do you want background on existing law and statute for
Well, and you have
monitoring the groundwater quality?
Sure, and you have some of that, I think, I mean, in the yellow portion, although it doesn't reference any of the regulations, really.
We have two regulations for, or let me back up. We have two statutes that require us to monitor groundwater, and one of those statutes in, well, there's one in the Environmental Protection Act and there's one in the Groundwater Protection Act. But we do have a network comprised of community water supply wells that are in the Mahomet Aquifer. And so every couple of years I have to do a statewide water quality report. So in this one that I'm working on now, I've chosen to do a special focus, to include a special focus for the task force on looking at the data from our ambient wells that are in the Mahomet Aquifer. Now, the other thing that is out there is that Senator Rose had negotiated is we split samples with a number of the landfills. And when you go out, guys collect samples, we collect samples. That's available on our website. But I was also wanting to make reference to that data in comparison to what we see in our ambient network in the Mahomet Aquifer. Now, there are also dedicated monitoring wells in the Mahomet Aquifer, and there's also been private well studies in the Mahomet Aquifer, and there's also non-community wells that are in the Mahomet Aquifer.
So Rick, is the question really not about a plan to monitor, but a plan to
protect the quality.
provide a report that pulls all that data together?
Yeah, as far as are you talking about C?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that I think is developing a plan as a task force to protect the quality of the groundwater. Obviously, one of the elements is looking at what the existing quality is. So what I've been talking about is just a factor in that. But you're going to maybe come up with a host of recommendations to protect the aquifer, which may include a lot of different things that we've been talking about.
Diane Marlin Urbana, is there one agency who keeps track of all the wells or all the users of the aquifer?
Well, one thing, the users, there is one thing. We do have a state interagency coordinating committee on groundwater. So we have the Water Survey, the Geo Survey, Illinois EPA, Department of Ag, and Department of Public Health. So we do tend to try to coordinate that and the U.S. Geological Survey. We do try to integrate that information into this water quality report. So, yeah, to the best that we can, we pull in the Department of Ag's monitoring well stuff, we pull in our ambient monitoring, we pull in USGS's, we'll pull in something that the surveys have done and try to reflect that in that water quality report. But there's also kind of a different question embedded in what you ask, and that is there a responsibility of one agency to keep track of all the wells? Well, if I look at the Groundwater Protection Act, yeah, there is, and that'd probably be the water survey.
Yeah, so we keep track of all the water use. And so we have a person who's dedicated to, we've sent surveys to all the big users that we know about. And we feel like we know most of them, and then they fill out the surveys and send them back. And, sometimes we don't get all of them back, but we can fill in data gaps and stuff. We don't have a good handle on where all the private well users are, but as far as the high-capacity wells, I think we do pretty well on that.
So are they required to report to you when a high user, a high quantity user? Or you have to?
For municipalities, I think they're all required to report to IEPA, and then we get the same data. The commercial ones, they report, but it's confidential, so we don't, like, how much a Caterpillar plant would put out or an ethanol plant. Some regard that as a trade secret, so we're not.
But you know about them. It's just that you
Yes,
don't know how
yes.
much they're using.
Yeah, so, if you were looked at Exxon's number, for example, of how much water they use out of their wells, you could figure out a competitor could figure out, how much oil they're running through, and Exxon may not want that information out. But, most of the time, that's not a secret, especially if it's used for cooling water or something like that.
Okay.
But I'll say that web GIS services that we have and we've put on the web page, we've consumed web services from the Geologic Survey. And so, I think we may not have a handle on all the private wells that are out there, but I would say we have a pretty good representation. If you go to the web service, turn on the community well layer, turn on the non-community well layer, turn on the ISGS database layer, and then it sounds complicated, but visually you can zoom in and get a pretty good idea of what wells might be in that area. And it's a pretty easy tool to use. If I can use it, then.
Maybe we could have a demonstration of that at some point.
One last quick question. Would the HTEM mapping map those wells? Can you, no? You can't detect them, okay.
Along the lines of big wells and users, if Nestle came and started bottling water, what does that look like? I mean, how big of a threat is that compared to, just what we're using already?
Well, we had a bottler in Paxton that was there for a while. Generally, bottling companies don't bottle that much. And we actually, there's a lot of bottled water already going on in Champaign because they buy from Illinois American and bottle it. So most bottling operations are buying treated water already because it's, then they don't have to soften it and everything else. So
Right.
It's already kind of hidden in what we do as a community.
Right. I mean, I guess that at least is then being monitored because Illinois American knows what they're putting through.
I don't want to rail against bottled water, but you're drinking the exact same water.
Yeah.
You might be drinking out of the tap.
Right. And at least there's also somebody's getting paid for it. At least we're not just giving away our resource. I guess I don't know, depends on. Anyways, okay. I guess that would be one thing I'd like to know is if we're thinking about quantity, what are our big users? Like who could be coming in and really, draining our aquifer? What does that look like? What companies would need to be moving in? Not specifically, what industries, I suppose?
Yeah, it's, to use a lot of water, it'd have to be somebody that's using water for cooling or something. So, then it gets down to, okay, if we look at First Energy in Gibson City, for example, they have an 11-mile pipeline that goes over to the Mahomet Aquifer. Because there wasn't enough groundwater to use locally. So they could only use that water so many times before they concentrate too many, there's some stuff in the Mahomet Aquifer that, you know, if they concentrate too many times, then they can't discharge it. So, you know, it's kind of self-limiting from that respect you know, because of the discharge side, if a big, you know, industry came in to use the Mahomet Aquifer as cooling water, you know, that would be a big use, but then they have to worry about discharging that. And so that becomes a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's sort of an accidental regulation.
Yeah, so it's somewhat, I don't want to say in a sense self-regulated, not self-regulated, that's not a word, but you know, there aren't a lot of big industries that would come in that would just consume water, you know, unless they're evaporating, you know, like a power plant or something. You know, even the U of I power plant doesn't have its own water source, but it has condensers and things like that.
Teresa, sorry, Teresa Barnett, DeWitt County Emergency Management. So when we're talking about the discharge, there are already regulations in place as far as what that can contain before it can be discharged, correct?
Yeah, and those regulations are a lot more, have been around a lot longer, I don't know if they're more sophisticated, but, yeah, there's discharge permits and for
Okay.
everything.
So that's my point, is that whoever's using it, whether it's large industry or whatever, they can't just push anything out. It has to be meeting the regulations that are in place now.
Yeah, and if you look at the example of the Cronus chemical plant that's been proposed for Tuscola, they want, well, I mean, they could use Mahomet Aquifer water and dump it into the Kaskaskia ditch like Quantum Chemical has done for 50 years. But they also wanted to look at using
Yeah, that's a federally backed permit. That's called a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, NPDES permit.
Thank you.
Okay, so are there other issues that people want to discuss before we kind of move forward in the agenda?
Can I make one more
Of
comment
course.
about, or make a comment going back?
And George, tell us who you are.
George Roquette, State Water Service. On the historic land.
I think your mic's not on.
I think EPA Land Division would be nervous about poking a bunch of holes into a kind of an unknown landfill, but on the same vein, it would be nice to have monitoring wells in the Mahomet Aquifer under these landfills, such as Champaign, which has no monitoring of the Mahomet Aquifer. You know, if they had chemicals that kind of short circuit a lot of the natural protections, such as industrial solvents that can go through some of the clays differently than water-soluble things. But then we also need to be very careful of what we're looking at, and I bring up the Indian Creek landfill as a good case. Before PDC bought it, I think. The monitoring wells had arsenic in them, and so everybody was pointing to the landfill. Well, then Tazewell County looked at it a little closer, and maybe EPA looked at it a little closer, and found out this was a widespread problem and that was naturally occurring, and that led to a whole lot of efforts on Tazewell County's part to understand the arsenic problem. So, you know, you have to be kind of careful on what you're looking at with that.
When you said concerns about poking holes, so, I mean, it makes sense to me that if you drill a well, you're introducing a contamination pathway that might carry pollutants faster than normal. But if the landfills are unlined anyways, does it really make a big difference?
Well, if there's a confining, naturally occurring confining layer there, and then you drill a hole in that, yeah.
I mean, so a well can't be sealed? It's not, they're not, is there a way to drill a well that isn't a contamination pathway?
No. Well, yes and no. I mean, you can seal the annulus, but the problem sometimes that would be a little concerned about is nobody knows and it's just the other side of it. Nobody really knows what's in these old landfills and what kind of contamination exists there. And it wouldn't be the first time that I've been involved with a site where somebody drilled a well and then that allowed contamination that was sort of up in a shallow zone that may be confined to a specific area, and now they've contaminated the lower aquifer that's, and then whatever's hydraulically connected to that. So it's a pretty tricky business to get into when you're doing that.
Can we?
These are in communities.
Can we use technology to assess are we penetrating a safety layer? The HTEM or anything like that?
Well, I suppose you could.
I'm also wondering if there's anything that we can do, I mean, it's sort of like a phase one. Can we do some document history and try to get some idea of manifests, or did none of that exist for the landfills that we're talking about?
There's probably a range of things, I would guess, Charles. I've been involved in some where it was one of these pre-law landfills, and we were getting some of the PFASs in a nearby, the perfluoral carbon contaminants. I thought, well, maybe that's a potentially, there could have been plating waste put in that landfill. I couldn't obtain a single record. So I guess it just kind of depends. But, you have to go back into the archives to dig through, and maybe there's still a regional person that may have existed or worked at the time that some of that happened, but maybe not.
Charles Hostetler, PDC. It's a case-by-case basis for some of these old things. But I should point out that there are a lot of techniques that have been developed for contaminated site investigations that are applicable to this situation. Definitely. And most people that do this for a living and that have to pay the consequences if they do it wrong would prefer to, in the case of a landfill, look in the unit itself with shallow techniques rather than to drill through the overburden and into the Mahomet, depending on where you would. I would rather see a shallow investigation based on my experience and my knowledge that's guided by the local hydrogeology than to drill a hole into the Mahomet. The USGS did a study where they looked at both trace amounts of agricultural chemicals and they looked at isotopes, and they found in parts of the aquifer, particularly in DeWitt County, that the biggest risk associated with introducing surficial, or I'll just call it young or juvenile water into the Mahomet, was associated with well drilling. It wasn't associated with landfilling, it wasn't associated with agriculture, it wasn't associated with chemical storage, it was associated with well drilling. And so our practice, number one, which is governed by the regulation and how it's interpreted, is we monitor the uppermost aquifer. And that's not the Mahomet aquifer. Okay? So that's a requirement. And if you go and look at our database whenever possible, except for the purposes of siting, which you have to develop certain data, we don't monitor the Mahomet. It's just not the right thing to do in general. So that's my 2 cents based on our experience.
Okay, so I think we're starting to lose critical mass of people who've got to go. So we can continue these conversations in our next subcommittee meeting. We do have an item on the agenda for a work plan, and I really want to push everybody on that because although these conversations continue to be interesting, we've got to get to the point where we can actually make recommendations and move forward. So it sounds like, based on our discussion, we have enough information for presentations for a meeting, another meeting. And I'm going to push everybody that we be prepared either at that meeting or the following to make a recommendation on what we've heard. How do we want to push that forward to be then included in the report? We don't have anything probably today for that, but I want us to be thinking in terms of looking at an issue and making a recommendation that can be moved forward to the full committee. Anybody want to add anything to that? Okay.
Jim Risley, Mahomet School District. I've sat here and listened to a lot of things that were incredibly complicated for me to understand and some that wasn't. But the one thing that keeps coming back to me as far as a focus is the withdrawal risk. And I remember you were talking about risk in the very first meeting we had, Alex, and the contamination risk that we're dealing with here, and what agencies or what science is going to help us understand what those acceptable risks are and what they are not, and trying to get an answer, a concrete, movable answer to that when you're talking about a work plan that we can present. That I think that would be helpful to me and the task force to be able to keep that focus on those risks.
Okay, and you've got that? Okay. Anybody else? So the next thing is future subcommittee meetings, and Mayor Stone, are you? Did this by Survey Monkey. We can certainly do that again. Do you have a space in Monticello that is able to tape and that we could all meet in? Okay. So then I will ask Barb to work with you, get some dates, and do a Survey Monkey. I'm assuming that we will want to meet, well, we won't meet before our next full meeting, but maybe a few times within the next month. I haven't, our legislators left. Does anybody know, did we get an extension or where that sits?
I haven't heard.
I hope so.
Okay. April 30th in normal.
I'm still working with them just to secure a meeting room, but it is in normal, in the town of Normal. Thank you.
Okay. And I think it starts at 10.
Yes, at 10 a.m.
Any subcommittee comments? Any public participation comments? All right, we need a motion to adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned.